We are joined by Earl Braun. He's a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. Professor, thank you very much for joining us. First, just kick us off with your take on the significance of this trip and the timing of it.
There is both symbolic and substantive significance to this. There are expectations on both sides. There are going to be benefits, but there are risks as well. And I think we are going to see over the next 2 days the contours of what they are agreeing to, and also the asymmetry between the two countries. You will recall that before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, there was a visit by Vladimir Putin, and he was told by Xi Jinping this would be a friendship without limits. But it is not a friendship of equals. And I think this is something that deeply affects that relationship to an extent that it makes it very uncomfortable for Russia, while at the same time, Moscow is not willing to admit that this relationship is one very much of unequals.
Professor Braun, I'm curious, why is Xi Jinping taking the risk of hosting Putin right now? Because you can argue that Xi made some progress in his most recent visit to France. There were earlier trips by EU leaders to China as well. And it comes at a time when Russian forces are advancing in Ukraine, which I keep hearing is a red line for Europe.
It is exactly the case, as you have suggested, that Xi Jinping has, in fact, tried to improve relations with Europe. He was partially successful in Eastern Europe, less so in Western Europe, where his reception was not nearly as warm, but clearly China understands the importance of having those relationships. They are facing very high tariffs in the United States. They hope to be better able to sell, particularly electrical vehicles, in Europe. So that relationship remains quite vital for China. And at the same time, their relationship with Russia can endanger that. So let me just first perhaps highlight some of the potential benefits that China can have from this relationship, this visit by Vladimir Putin. Russia is a huge supplier of energy and raw materials to China. Russia has become increasingly dependent on China. Russia conducts the largest amount of trade with China, both in terms of exports as well as imports. And the raw materials that it is selling, including fossil fuels to China, means that in many ways Russia has become a kind of hewer of wood and drawer of water, not a modern economy. But there's one exception, and that is in the military realm. There, Russia has technology that the Chinese want, which Russia has been reluctant to pass on. Certain very high-level hypersonic technology, anti-satellite technology, where the Russians are at the cutting edge. That technology is worrying the West, but China may want that technology because if China should engage in any kind of conflict with Taiwan, they would like to damage the American ability to monitor the satellite ability as possible, and Russia may have that technology. China is also significantly increasing its military spending. Though the Chinese economy is only growing by something like 5%, they are increasing their military expenditures by something like 7.2%, and in fact, it's higher if you look at the CIPRI figures. They've just launched the third aircraft carrier. They want to have more nuclear weapons, better guidance systems, and this is where Russia can help. And Russia is in less and less of a position to refuse to transfer that technology. So these are the benefits of having a relationship with China is so dominant, where China has an enormous amount of leverage because Russia needs Chinese support and it needs Chinese goods. But at the same time, indeed, there are risks because a close relationship with Russia not only damages the relationship that China is building or trying to maintain with the European states, or even with the US, but it is also the case that in that closeness with Ukraine, there are risks. Even though Russia seems to be doing somewhat better right now, the tide might turn. The Russians are going to make ever greater demands on Chinese help, both in terms of economics, the military, as well as political support at the United Nations. It is also the case that you never want to have a weak ally try to make decisions for you. It's really a risky kind of undertaking, and Russia is increasingly a problematic ally. There's
Sure.
also a reaction to the Chinese armament. China now is seeing that Japan is rapidly increasing its defense expenditures. So are other countries. So there's pushback, and the negatives may be greater than China realizes.
Yeah, speaking of risk, Professor, I mean, the two sides are deepening their ties and cooperation. But as you pointed out, you characterize China-Russia relations as not a friendship of equals. So what are the risks, the potential risk or consequences for Russia relying too heavily on China? Is this a concern for Moscow, or is it a calculated trade-off that they are willing to accept?
Russia is basically a one-man dictatorship. There is no Communist Party. There's no party of any consequence. What they have in the Duma is basically entirely a rubber stamp to Putin, and there's not even a structure of leadership. It's a very personalist regime, run more like an organized crime syndicate than a country. So Vladimir Putin is willing to mortgage the future of his country in order to preserve his personal power. And so he is making Russia more into a vassal state of China's. He's trying to rationalize that away by saying, well, even Alexander Nevsky, the Russian Tsar, paid tribute to the Golden Horde because they were less dangerous than dealing with the West. This is not what Russia has been about for the past 300 years. It is not only a risky undertaking on the part of Vladimir Putin, but it is likely to cause long-term damage to Russia. It is something that is resented by huge numbers of the Russian population. And ultimately, I suspect it's not going to work out well, even in the short and medium term, maybe just in the shortest term, but not in the next couple of years, because things may look up temporarily for Russia, but the long-term prospect for Russia, unless somehow Ukraine collapses, those long-term prospects for Russia are not good.
Prof. Braun, you've outlined the benefits to China, from this relationship. We also know that China has not traditionally responded well to any form of external pressure. But at the same time, I want to know whether circumstances have changed. I mean, the BBC has been saying that their analysis shows that state media, Chinese state media, are not using, the terms unlimited or limitless anymore. So is there a chance that Western pressure, the threat of sanctions and so forth, may actually force, coerce, if you would, persuade Beijing to change its behavior slightly? Let's not forget the Chinese economy is in a difficult phase right now as well.
It may be one of the factors, and I think we cannot exclude that. And indeed, the Chinese economy is not as doing as well as it has been. And China's aggressive behavior in the region has provoked a huge pushback. So we have to ask some tough questions about the viability and the wisdom of Chinese long-term policy, where again more and more power is concentrated into the hands of Xi Jinping, though there is still a party structure. But there may be one other element at work as well, that as Russian dependence increases on China, as Russia functions more and more as a vassal state, though there may be this imaginary belief in Moscow that they are real partners, China may feel more confident in manipulating, leveraging, or pressuring Russia.
Interesting take, Professor. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll have to leave it there for now, but we've been speaking to Aurel Braun, a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto.